Do you have some deep philosophical question that you want answered, but you're not quite sure where to look? And if you do find some kind of article, maybe it's a little difficult to understand. So, where do you go to help you break it down and get a better grasp on it? How do you do this kind of philosophical research? That's what we're going to talk about tonight with my guests, Dr. Liz Jackson on the far right there, and Justin Mooney in the middle. So, this is the Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology for yourself. So, please take just a moment, guys, and introduce yourselves. I've had both of them on the channel, so you don't have to say much, but just your background in philosophical research that might be relevant.
Sure, I guess I can go first. So I'm Liz. Yeah, I have been on this channel a couple times. So I'm a professor, an assistant professor of philosophy at Ryerson University. So I guess in terms of background in philosophical research, I did the grad school thing, wrote the dissertation, and now part of what my job is to do research. So that's a good third of my job, if not even slightly more. And I guess another thing that might be worth mentioning too is I actually spent a year doing what's called a postdoc. Some of you probably know what that is, but basically what it is when you're paid to do research full time in philosophy. So I have that background as well.
Cool. Yep.
How about you, Justin?
Yep. I'm Justin Mooney, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the philosophy department. I am about halfway through a dissertation right now. So that involves quite a bit of philosophical research. And I've published a few papers in philosophy journals, and those all embody some, research in the background. So yeah, Liz and I are going to hopefully help you learn how to do research in philosophy today.
Very cool. Okay, well, let's jump right into it. So if you want to set this thing up before I show the slides, but the good thing is, let me mention this now. So everything that these two are going to say tonight has all been nicely packaged for you in the description for the video. So there's a link there. I think it's like bit.ly/philosophical research, something like that. And if you go there, you're going to see all the slides that we're using. And at the very end, there's a Google Doc with even more information. So I want to really help you all go forward doing the best kind of research that you can. YouTube needs it. Okay, so I prefaced it a little, but you all take over. You tell me what you'd want to cover first.
Okay, so I think we can just start with the first slide there, the 5 points all on one slide.
Okay, let me put that up right now.
Cool.
And maybe I'll just jump in here and let everyone know. I think basically what we're going to do is Justin and I are going to kind of each take a slide, like we'll take every other slide. And then, at the end of each slide, if either of the other two people want to add anything, we'll do it then. But we're basically going to switch off. So just so the audience knows our basic plan.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Liz and I kind of put together a little 5-step procedure for investigating a philosophical topic. And I think probably, we didn't actually talk about this, but I think probably Liz would agree that this procedure it's more like a recommendation. And what we're recommending is probably more like do something that's an approximation of these 5 steps. But, it'll vary a little bit depending on your particular situation, exactly which step happens first or second, or if you're going to even do all of them or whatever. But anyway, here then is one, we think, good way to go about investigating a philosophical topic. So first of all, determine your aim, by which we mean, you got to be clear about why are you investigating this philosophical topic, because there are different reasons for doing philosophical research, and depending on what your reason is, there are going to be differences in the approach that you take, and Liz will tell us a little bit about that pretty soon. Also, early on in the process, you're going to want to settle on a topic or a question. So if you're a student in a philosophy class, Sometimes professors will assign a paper topic to you, but other times they'll leave it open and you'll have to choose your own topic. And so one thing you want to do early in the process rather than later is settle on the topic that you want to think about. And it's important to be really clear, I think, about what your topic or question is, because that'll help focus your research as you go forward. Okay, and then the third step will be to find a trustworthy overview of your topic. Liz is going to tell us in a little while exactly what that means and maybe show us some examples of trustworthy overviews. Once you've found a trustworthy overview, you want to use it to map out a research plan. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how to do that. And then finally, if you are ultimately aiming to write a paper, then you want to decide what kind of paper you're going to write, because there are different sorts of papers and they look different and you're going to need different information for them depending on which one you go with. Okay, so those are like the 5 steps in outline, and then now we'll just take each of them one at a time and go in a little more detail.
All right, perfect. So step number 1 is basically determine your aim. Determine why you want to do philosophical research. And Justin and I came up with at least 3 reasons you might. I guess there could be even other ones besides these, but we're going to talk about at least these 3. So the first reason is for personal fulfillment. So maybe you're just interested in philosophical questions and you're just curious and you want to know, like, do we have free will? I think I was probably like this for a lot of my undergrad. I took philosophy classes. I was a philosophy major, but I would just like eat up philosophy, and I just wanted to learn about all these different topics in philosophy, and also other topics actually, like in theology and physics. I would like go try to learn about those for personal fulfillment as well. So you might do it just to satisfy curiosity or to figure out about something you've been doubting, learn more information about that. So that's one kind of reason you might want to, do some philosophical research. A second reason you might want to do philosophical research is for a class assignment. So Justin mentioned this. You might have a philosophy class and you're supposed to write a paper for it. And sometimes the paper is specific, sometimes it's very open-ended. But in any case, you might have to do philosophical research because it's required for some class you're in. And then the final reason that you might want to do philosophical research is for publication. And this is probably going to be mostly for people, but not solely, but mostly for people that are probably either in grad school or maybe teaching at a university, have some kind of professional. They're professional philosophers in some way. Oftentimes, publication is actually required. So if you're in grad school, sort of the unfortunate reality of the job market is it's really difficult to get a job if you don't have any publications. Maybe not impossible, but I think at this point, most grad students are strongly encouraged to publish. But then also publication is a super important part of getting tenure, which basically once you are hired to teach philosophy, for many positions, tenure is kind of what makes it very difficult to fire you and makes your job a permanent job. So publishing in philosophy is a very important part of getting tenure as well. So I guess one thing to sort of note is how the process looks exactly, and the specifics of the process are going to vary depending on which of these reasons, or maybe other reasons, you're wanting to do philosophical research. So just a couple maybe examples of this. If you are trying to publish a philosophy paper in an academic journal, you're going to need to learn the literature and engage with a lot more of the views in the literature, because that's just what's expected. And if you want your paper to be sent out to reviewers and the reviewers to give a positive assessment of it, you're going to need to know kind of what people are saying, what are the main papers in that literature, to read them and be familiar with them, and for your paper to demonstrate that. But if you're just writing something for a class assignment or for personal fulfillment, you don't necessarily need to have that depth of familiarity with the literature, and kind of depending on your goals, that might just not be necessary or realistic. You might want to instead, look for something more like an overview or something written at a more popular level. So it'll depend on your level and your goals exactly how that goes. But the way you kind of go about these 5 steps, I think, will change depending on your aim. So So yeah, I think that was basically what I wanted to say about that. I don't know if Justin or Jordan, either of you wanted to add anything there.
I'll just add one thing, which is that if you're in either of the second two of those three reasons, then you have the advantage of guidance. You're going to either have the guidance of your professor, or if you're a grad student, you often have the guidance of multiple people in the department that you're in, faculty members and other grad students and so forth. And so you're not doing this on your own. So the standards, even though they're higher in those contexts, you also have more help.
Yeah, I'm grateful for this channel because I've benefited from you all and the people you've introduced me to. So I have help when I make videos and notes and so forth. But I feel like I'm stuck currently in that for personal fulfillment. But who knows? Maybe someday I can get a master's or PhD or something. All right, let's keep moving.
Cool. All right, so step 2 was settle on a topic or a question. So like I mentioned earlier, depending on your situation, you might already have your topic figured out by the time you've decided you want to do research on it because you're wondering about it, and that's kind of the spur to do research, or because you're in a class and you've been assigned a certain topic. But if you are in a situation where you're needing to select a topic, what you want to do, I would say, is first of all, gravitate towards things that already seem interesting to you, because that's going to help motivate you in the project, right? If something is already boring, then you don't want to delve into that topic, probably, because you're going to have a hard time being motivated as you work on, because research can be hard work. It takes time, and it's a lot of reading, and sometimes it's hard to understand what you read and so forth. So pick something that's interesting. Another thing to think about, though, is you got to be careful about how narrow or broad your topic is. So one thing to worry about and to try to avoid is picking a topic that's too broad. Because if you pick a topic that's too broad, then you're biting off more than you can chew, right? So like some huge topic where there's been so much written on it, it's going to be very, very hard for you to kind of survey the territory and synthesize all that information and come up with a nice, clean paper if that's what you're aiming for. You want to pick a narrow enough topic that it's manageable. On the other end of the spectrum, though, it's also a risk that, you want to try to not pick a topic that like nobody has written about or that hardly anybody has worked on, right? So this is like a standard piece of advice that professors will give their students. If you pick a topic where there's almost nothing written on it, then you're going to have like the opposite problem. Instead of too much information, there's too little. You have almost nothing to work with. So you want to be careful about that. And again, the advantage of like being in the context of like a philosophy class is that you have guidance from the teacher on like what topics might be good or not. Just to give one concrete example, if you're in a philosophy class and you're thinking, I want to write a paper on, say, whether God exists, that might be a bit too broad of a topic. That's a huge subject. And so one thing you can do if you're thinking, oh, but I really want to write about, the topic, does God exist, is just, okay, so stay within that topic, but then pick like a smaller subtopic in that area. So pick, say, like a specific argument for the existence of God or against the existence of God, and then focus on just that argument. And, if you think, well, but the other arguments are interesting too, well, you can always get to those at a later time, right? Maybe that's your next paper. Okay, so that's something. Now, I also want to say something about people who are not in the context of a class. So one thing I see a lot of in certain corners of the internet where there are a lot of lay people who are interested in philosophy is you get a lot of people asking questions like, I want to know how to respond to such and such a very specific objection to such and such a very specific argument. Okay, I see tons and tons of this, and they go looking for like a specific answer to that question. I think that when you find yourself asking that kind of question, it might be a good idea for you to actually broaden the scope of what you're thinking about, right? Instead of just like, oh, okay, here's a new objection I heard to an argument that I'm aware of, and I just want to find an answer to that objection, I think you should maybe consider diving into the broader literature on that topic, whatever argument it is you're thinking about, and doing some kind of extensive research on it. And that's because, for one thing, most likely you'll find that your question has been discussed by the scholars. And so you'll end up finding an answer to that question. But the other thing is you'll end up finding answers to questions that you haven't asked yet, but would otherwise be asking. Because if you just take this approach of like, every time you come across a new objection to some argument that you're aware of, you go and try to track down specifically, an answer to that objection, but you don't do like a broader in-depth study of that argument, that's just going to happen again and again, right? There's going to be a new objection and a new objection. But if you actually take the time to do a detailed study, you can preempt that happening again. And so what will happen instead is when the next objection comes along, instead of it being another, oh, I've never heard of this before, what do I say? It'll be more like, oh, I know this objection, and I know how it fits into the broader network of the scholarly discussion, and I know what various scholars have said about it. Anyway, so that's a thought that I think
Here's an analogy that came to mind. It may be a poor one, but if you put together puzzles, like big ones, like 1,000-piece puzzles, at least I don't do this. Maybe other people do. It seems like torture if you take this approach. If you're just like, where's this one specific piece? And you're going to struggle if you do it that way. But if you have an approach where you kind of step back and fill the picture in more broadly, you'll come to find that specific piece. But in the process, you're going to fill in the broader picture. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad analogy.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. I think one thing I was actually going to mention kind of on the reverse things, which is being, we're saying don't be too broad, don't be too narrow. And I think that's right. But I do think one thing that I've kind of learned in a couple years of doing philosophical research is just how much there is written on a topic. And I think you would be surprised, like something like the Kalam cosmological argument, you might think that's a pretty specific argument for God's existence. And I mean, I'm sure there's just hundreds of papers and books written on that argument, and books written on one premise of that argument, and then sometimes books written on a footnote of someone else's book of a premise of that argument. And I mean, things just get really, really, really specific. I mean, this is cool. It's good in a way and bad in a way. I mean, it's great that there's been so much research done on these topics, but part of it is also this pressure that we have as academics to publish. A lot of stuff does get published. So, we can talk about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and it's probably some of both. But I do want to kind of just warn people, this is one reason why you should be careful not being too broad, just because there's just a lot out there, and you're probably going to get overwhelmed pretty quickly if your topic is too broad.
Yeah, actually, perfect example of what you were just saying, Liz. It's not the Kalam argument, but I was thinking of Proust's book on the principle of sufficient reason. So that's an entire book on one premise of one argument for theism. I mean, it's relevant to other things as well, besides that argument for theism. But still, that's one premise in one argument for theism.
Exactly.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move forward. So at this point, someone has figured out their aim. They've narrowed it down to a specific topic or question. So then step 3.
Okay, so step 3, I think this is very useful, and I do this all the time, especially when I'm sort of diving into a new topic in philosophy. So step 3 is find a trustworthy overview of your topic. And I think both of those are very important. Trustworthy is very important, but also overview is important. So let's talk about some overviews first. And here, I think we just want to get really practical, and I think give you guys some of the standard resources that philosophers use and give their students. So I'm actually just going to go down this list of kind of standard overviews and talk a little bit about each one, so you can kind of get a sense of where you might look once you've kind of determined this topic and you're trying to find a good overview of it. So the first place that a lot of people go especially professional philosophers, but a lot of people not doing professional philosophical research either, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this is totally open access. I forget, I think that website might just be Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.org or something, but if you just Google it, it'll come right up. They have overview topics on lots and lots of different topics in philosophy. They're usually longer, and they can be a little bit more dense and detailed, especially if you're looking up something that's more of a technical topic. So like, I think that there's maybe one on decision theory, and it's kind of hard to understand, especially if you're new to that topic. So I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is great, and you can know with the SEP, it's often called the SEP, that you're getting high quality research done by top scholars in the field. I think the only downside is that if you're sort of newer to philosophy, it can be dense and difficult to understand at points. But you could even look at it and kind of see, well, what are the main things that they talk about in this entry? What are kind of the subsections within the entry? And then you can look at the bibliography as well and see kind of who's cited in there. So that's, I think, kind of the go-to place that a lot of philosophers go. But a second encyclopedia that's also open access and free for everyone on the internet is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this encyclopedia is also, tell me if you guys think I'm wrong, but normally written by scholars. Sorry, I'm getting text messages, so I have to turn Do Not Disturb off. Okay, it's normally written by kind of legit, serious philosophical scholars, so it's trustworthy, like I mentioned, but I think it's a little bit more accessible and easy to understand. I'm not super confident in this. It might be that it covers slightly less topics than the SEP. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is going to be a little more accessible and easier to understand. And I don't think it's as much of a go-to as SEP, but it's still a very, very valuable resource. So our third potential place you could look for an overview, it's a journal that's called Philosophy Compass. And I love Philosophy Compass. I think it's great. There's a couple things I like about it. One is that, again, it's topic overviews. That's what the journal is meant to do. It's for people to write topic overviews, and they're written by experts on the topics. And what I like about it is that they're limited to 5,000 words. And I think that is very, very valuable, because with 5,000 words, you can get a good amount of detail in there, but you still are forced to make it an overview. It's not like the SEP is like 10,000, 20,000 words. It's so long. And I think the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy can be long too. So I like Philosophy Compass a lot for that reason. I think the main downside of Philosophy Compass is, unfortunately, it's not open access. So if you have a friend who has access to a library, you could ask them to get an article for you. There's also, I'll tell everyone this, there's a Facebook group that is called the Philosophical Underclass that you can join, and you can actually request articles there, and then people will send them to you. So if there's an article from Philosophy Compass you wanted and didn't have access to, I really encourage people not to just buy them, because they're like $50 or more just for an individual to buy them. So you could try that. So there is workarounds for this. But yeah, that is the big downside of Philosophy Compass, is that it's not open access. Okay, so we're moving kind of from longer to shorter. So the fourth kind of overview is called 1,000 Word Philosophy. And I actually just wrote an 1,000-word philosophy piece on Pascal's wager. And one thing I really like about 1,000 Word Philosophy is it's in the title that they're kept to 1,000 words. So it's a great place to just get a really basic overview of some topic. And again, like the first three, written by professional philosophers, it's trustworthy. There are a couple downsides of 1,000 Word Philosophy. I think the biggest two are, one, there's just a lot of topics that they haven't written on, but they are continually producing new articles. So it's not guaranteed that they would necessarily have a topic you're interested in, but they're growing. So hopefully they'll continue to grow. But then number two is like the purpose of 1,000 Word Philosophy isn't necessarily to like cite a bunch of the relevant literature or like tell you where to go from there. It's much more introductory. So kind of depending on your aim, if you're just wanting a basic overview of a topic, it's great. But if you're wanting to then get ideas for things to read, it might give you some of that, but it wouldn't be nearly as good as Philosophy Compass or SEP, something like that. And then the other thing that I often point my students to that I really like, and there might be other series of this as well, there's a series of videos, they're called Wireless Philosophy, and they have a YouTube channel and a website. And what I really like about them is they professional philosophers are the ones that make these videos, and they have super cool animations. Reminds me of another channel that maybe is the next one on this list. But I use wireless philosophy in my classes all the time. The videos are normally like 10-ish minutes. They usually have helpful examples, cool animations, and again, they're done by like legit people that really know what they're talking about. So one example is Jennifer Nagel has this awesome series of like an introduction to epistemology, and it's just really well done. For those of you who don't know, Jennifer Nagel is a great epistemologist working at the University of Toronto, very well respected in the field. And so they have people like that doing the videos. And then the final thing is obviously Jordan's channel, when I was describing wireless philosophy, has many of the same characteristics. We appreciate how Jordan wants to interact with, and does interact with professional philosophers, love animated videos. And Jordan has a lot of resources, especially on topics in philosophy, religion. So that's another place to look as well. And again, this is not a fully complete list. I'm sure, Capturing Christianity is obviously another one. He has a lot of great videos. There's probably other internet resources as well that are good, but at least this is a good place to get you started. And I would say, again, the top is kind of the most intense, you're going to get the most citations, but it's probably going to be the most technical and the least accessible. And then as you move down, I think it gets more accessible, but maybe you'll get less citations. It won't be as technical, but maybe not. I mean, it depends. And the videos, obviously, Jordan will do couple hour long interviews with a scholar that do get very technical. So it does depend, but in general, the top's going to be the least accessible, and it will get more accessible as you move down the list. Okay, and then that was a little bit long, but I hope it's helpful to kind of see what each of those resources are kind of about. And then the second point I wanted to make here is just when you're Googling something, let's say you're like, I want to learn about, we can stick to the same example, the Kalam cosmological argument, and then you Google that. A lot of stuff is going to come up, blog posts, maybe a random book that someone wrote. And if you're not familiar with the names of professional philosophers and theologians, or you wouldn't know like what are the main things people would be citing or wouldn't be citing. You might see a blog and say, hey, this looks kind of interesting. Wow, it's really long and detailed. Like, should I take the time to read it? And I think that's a really good question. But I think just because there's a resource out there and just because maybe looks interesting to you doesn't always mean it's worth taking the time to really sit down and read it closely. And I'm not trying to knock anyone, but there are a lot of people on the internet, and anyone can post anything on the internet. And so just because you find something by Googling it doesn't necessarily mean that it's worth spending a ton of time on it. And that's why we gave you this specific list. We think these are places that are worth spending your time on. And it can be difficult to judge whether something is good to spend your time on or not. But a general rule of thumb is either stick to academic journals and books, kind of depending on your aim, especially if you're trying to publish or maybe writing for a grad level. If you're more just trying to satisfy your curiosity, then try to find non-academic sources or overviews that are in some way connected to the academic world. So if you're watching a YouTube video, you might want to say, like, what are this person's connections to the academic world? Are they studying or teaching at a university that I've heard of? What have they published recently? And this isn't going to be a perfect rule. Of course, there are great people out there that maybe aren't publishing continually or whatever. But I think this is at least a good rule of thumb to kind of help us rule out what's worth reading, what's not worth reading. So I don't know if you guys want to add some stuff.
Yeah, so I think a good example of the kind of source you were just talking about would be Jordan's channel, The Analytic Christian, right? So it's not an academic source per se, right? YouTube videos are kind of not really academic sources in general, but it is what I would call an academically informed source. And what I mean by that is it's a resource that is designed at sort of communicating scholarship to lay people. And so this is the kind of source that you can use fruitfully in your research.
Justin, did I lose you?
Am I gone?
You cut out for just a second, I think.
I'm okay. Am I back now?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay. I think did you hear anything that I said about your channel?
Yeah, I heard that you said that my channel was the most authoritative academic source that anyone could access.
That's right. Okay.
100%.
I guess one other thought is this is something Liz basically said, but just to kind of add a little bit, I think that lay people are actually usually not very good at discerning like the quality of academic work. They can't. They have a hard time telling the difference between low and high quality academic work, and so that just makes it all the more important to stick to like the sources that Liz just laid out and sources like that as your guide for determining what to read and what not to read.
Yeah, and I think it's hard too, just because clear and easy to read doesn't always mean introductory or not scholarly, and difficult and technical and hard to read doesn't always mean really scholarly and, you know, academic and someone who knows what's going on. And, you know, I think of Mike Humer, for example. I don't know if either of you have read him. He is one of the clearest, simplest writers ever, but he's probably published more in like the top 10% of philosophers. So he's a very well-respected academic, but he writes very clearly and just gives these simple examples and doesn't use big words just to use big words. And I think that's great. I think that's actually how we should all strive to write. And then, you know, there's probably other people, I don't know if I could just give an example off the top of my head, that I wouldn't necessarily put into the category of informed scholar that I would recommend people read, but probably use a lot of big words and are difficult to understand and might sound impressive because they use a big vocabulary. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind, is simple and clear doesn't really always tell us something about whether it's you know, academically informed. But I do think in general, simple and clear is better and probably worth spending more of your time on. And I actually kind of get annoyed some of these SEP articles, again, not to call anyone out specifically, but they're just overly technical and they're almost using technicalities just to use technicalities. And I don't think that's good either. So I guess another thing to say is we're not saying these sources are perfect either. There's problems with some of them, and some of them might be difficult to understand for various reasons. But in general, I think these are solid places to start.
All right, well, let's go on to step 4 then.
Cool. All right, so once you've found your trustworthy overview, the step 4 is to use it to map out a research plan. So here's the way I think about this. The way these overviews are set up, I mean, some of them are better than others, but the intent is for them to kind of give you a picture of a certain corner of scholarly conversation, a picture of like, what does the scholarly discussion on this topic look like? What are the main, you know, questions that are being talked about, positions that are being defended? Who are the main conversation partners, and where are they having this conversation, and what journals or books or other venues are they primarily publishing, and so forth. Okay, so what you want to do is take that trustworthy overview and use it to figure out, like, okay, what is the most important stuff for me to read? So you can look at what sources does that overview treat as most important or influential or whatever, and then go find those sources and look at what which other sources that those sources treat as most important or influential and whatever, and start watching for patterns. Start looking for like, oh, I've seen this particular author mentioned over and over again, or this particular paper mentioned over and over again. And you'll start to begin to get a sense of, like, you know, the contours of the discussion, and some of, like, you know, the people who are regarded as, like, you know, the maybe the most influential on that topic, and the papers that are regarded as the most important contributions to the discussion and stuff like that. And with that kind of information, it'll become easier for you to discern like what's worth reading and what's not worth reading. So you can start to put together a reading list for yourself of like, okay, I want to read this and this and this, and I don't have to read that. Of course, it's not just like what's important and influential that you know, matters when selecting what to read. You're also going to want to pay attention to what's relevant. So, you know, just because you're working on a certain topic, like, say, the problem of evil, doesn't mean that every important paper on the problem of evil is relevant to your particular research project, because the problem of evil is one of those huge subjects where there's a whole bunch of different topics. And you might be working in one corner of the problem of evil, and there's papers that are really important for another corner, but that's not necessarily important for what you're doing. So another thing that you can do then, in addition to just keeping track of like who gets cited most and so forth, is look at the abstract of papers. So fortunately, most academic papers are published with abstracts. And for anyone who doesn't know, an abstract is just sort of like a summary of what the paper argues. And it's usually just 1 or 2 paragraphs or something like that. Especially in philosophy, abstracts tend to be pretty short. And so just by reading that one paragraph, you get an idea of what the paper is doing, and you can decide on the basis of that information, like, okay, is this a paper that's worth my time or not? Is it relevant to what I'm, thinking about, or is it not? And then I guess at this point, we've already kind of covered the stick to academic sources and academically informed sources, so I won't reiterate that.
Oops, I'm echoing. Do I sound okay to you guys?
You were, but I don't hear it now.
Okay, it's much better now. Okay, great. So I guess I wanted to add too, I think this kind of thing kind of lies on a spectrum, I guess. And again, this comes back to your aim. What is your goal in this? And what your research plan looks like, I think, is going to depend on your goal. So on one end of the spectrum, there's a couple topics that I write on a lot. And I have multiple papers on them. They're topics that are very central to the core of my research. So some examples would be like Pascal's wager, the relationship between belief and credence, epistemic permissivism, for me personally. And what I've done for these topics, what I've actually done is I have a extremely long, detailed bibliography of what I've tried to every single article on those topics. And that might sound really crazy at first, but I've actually used this exact method we're talking about to make that bibliography, and I have not read, in a lot of cases, even half of those articles. What I've done is I've read the abstracts, I've skimmed maybe the intro and the conclusion for some of them, and then as I go through that process, I figured out what I need to read and what I maybe don't need to read. But nonetheless, I'll put them in a bibliography, and like, just to take my Pascal's wager one, for example, it has categories: historical sources, so people more talking about what is Pascal's historical context, what did he actually mean when he wrote the wager, and then arguments for the wager, arguments against the wager, arguments that aren't really for or against the wager but are kind of relevant, and then I think maybe I have a category that's like applications of the wager to other things, so people have applied the wager to like euthanasia and climate change and different topics. And so this is actually super helpful because I'm writing so many articles on Pascal's wager that I have this bibliography, and I can go through and say, oh, this person argued this. And a lot of times I'll put a little bullet point or a note under the article, just here's some things about what this article is about. Here's, it might be useful if I'm addressing the irrationality objection or whatever. And I mentioned this because this is like one end of the spectrum. This would be like, you're writing on a topic a lot, and you're trying to publish in peer-reviewed journals. But you could even do something that's like a way less extreme version of this. And I've actually done this for topics I wouldn't write about as much, but I needed to like add a section talking about some literature. I would maybe just have a 10-item bibliography, and I just kind of write down a few things I see cited really frequently in some literature, and then some notes to myself about it. And that's actually really, really useful to be able to come back to later as well. So that's just kind of I guess an example of sort of how I do this, but there's obviously a lot of different ways to do it, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, all this is. So we're going to go to the 5th step, and this will be the final one that we talk about. And then we're going to get a few questions from you, the viewers. So go ahead. If you have a question, you can begin typing it now while they finish up with this slide. So you can type your question, but all I ask is that you write the word question at the beginning. So when I look at the live chat, it's very quick and easy for me to spot those questions. Okay, so you guys continue. Okay, so this is kind of our last step. And we put
if applicable at the end, because whether you do this or not is going to depend on your aim. So the last step is kind of decide what kind of paper to write. If you are researching a topic for personal fulfillment, you may or may not write a paper. We're not saying you have to, obviously. But if you have a class assignment, usually, especially if it involves writing, and then if you're publishing, you'll obviously be writing a paper. So we thought it was worth mentioning. And I think this way of categorizing things is probably going to be most applicable to the writing a paper for publication. But if you have a more open-ended class assignment, then I think thinking about this taxonomy could also be helpful for that as well. So Justin and I have basically categorized philosophical papers into four different categories. And I think especially if you're kind of a graduate student and you're kind of thinking about like, I'd like to get some publications, what are some papers I might write? Here's some categories you might think. So the first sort of category is a book review. And journals do book reviews, academic journals. Also, there's places like Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. That's just kind of a venue for doing book reviews. But what I like about book reviews is it's kind of a low stakes publication to kind of get your feet wet, get yourself kind of learning how publication works, but it's a lot easier. And you don't have these like intense reviewers that you have to please. So it is easier. You're often invited to do it. And so a lot of times if you're wanting to get into philosophical publishing, a book review is a great place to start. And basically what you would do in a book review, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, is you would spend maybe the first third or half talking about the contents of the book. And then the second 2/3 to half sort of giving some responses to the book, maybe things you agreed with, maybe some objections, maybe some ways you could further develop that argument, or places that argument might interact with other similar arguments. And book reviews are often shorter as well. So that's kind of, I think, a low stakes way you can kind of get your feet wet in publishing, especially if you're kind of interested in it, but don't know if you're quite ready to take on the peer review process. So that's sort of the first kind of paper. The second is what you might call an overview paper. And actually, a lot of the resources we were talking about in, I think, step 3, which was when you're getting an overview of the topic, would fall into this category. And so what an overview paper does is it basically just presents an overview of a certain literature. So I have a philosophy compass paper on the relationship between belief and credence. And I basically say, here are the main views in the literature. I'm not really arguing for them. I might be explaining arguments that other people have given, but I'm not necessarily saying this view is correct or this view is incorrect. I'm just kind of giving people a lay of the land. Again, it could also be a paper similarly like laying out logical space on a certain topic. So actually, Justin and I are writing a paper together that might kind of look like this one. We're sort of, we're doing this thing we told you not to do, but I guess at a certain stage you can do it where you're talking about something that people haven't talked about as much, which our question is whether God has credences. I'm not saying no one's talked about it, but it's just kind of an underexplored question. And then if God has credences and beliefs, how would those relate to each other? So that's what our paper is about. But we're going to be doing a lot of laying out logical space, partially just because not a lot has been written on God's credences and God's beliefs and how those might relate to each other. So those are sort of two kinds of overview papers. And I guess I'll say too, oftentimes if you're writing a dissertation, you will have 1 or even 2 chapters that are overview papers like this. And part of the point of that is to show your advisor and your dissertation committee that you have a good sense of the literature. You kind of know what the main views are, what the main arguments for and against are. And people do publish these, but they are more often invited, I would say. A lot of like Philosophy Compass has kind of a weird process where you email someone and then they can choose to invite you to submit or not. And then sometimes you might write an overview paper that will be like a book chapter or something. But in most cases, you're not going to write an overview paper to just send to a journal to be peer reviewed. Most cases. That's not always true, but oftentimes journals want one of the next 2 kinds of papers that we're going to talk about. Okay, so the third paper that you might write is a negative paper. And a negative paper is basically a paper saying some thesis or view is false. And there are sort of 2 kinds of negative papers. One is more specific and one is more general. So a lot of times, when I said if there's someone they want to kind of dive into philosophy publishing, I said I might have them start with a book review. After that, I might suggest that they write this first kind of negative paper, which is often what's called a response paper. And a response paper, they takes a pretty specific article or maybe book or maybe small set of articles and basically directly responds to it and says, this is why this author's argument doesn't work or this view is wrong. So that the goal of a response paper is often not this broad thing like making this huge move that affects this big literature, but really it's arguing against one specific argument that one specific person has made. And what's interesting about these papers is a lot of journals, if you write a good response paper to something published in their journal, they actually have a very specific category of paper that you can submit. And I think the chances of you getting that accepted, as long as you have good arguments against that paper, are a lot higher. So I think this is kind of a good second step if you're kind of getting into philosophy publishing, is writing a paper that argues against a very specific paper called a response paper. But another kind of negative paper that's more broad would be a paper that argues against a more general view. So you're not just focusing on one article or book, but you're focusing on a view that a lot of people have defended. You could even say, here's why the Kalam cosmological argument fails or something. So you're not then giving your own positive argument. You're just saying this argument fails. And I mean, at this point, that's a broad enough view that enough people have defended that it wouldn't be a response paper. It would be a negative general paper. So that's sort of the third category. And then the final category of paper that you might write is a positive paper. A positive paper, maybe obviously, argues for a positive thesis, would be a lot of them. So here's a new argument for consequentialism, for example. Here's a new argument that God exists. Those would be positive papers. A lot of papers in philosophy are positive papers. Sometimes they're combinations of positive and negative papers. But then a final kind of positive paper that maybe isn't talked about as much is a paper that presents a new paradox or puzzle that philosophers haven't yet noticed. And actually there's a number of papers. Andrew Moon has a paper like this, where the main point of the paper isn't necessarily to argue for a positive thesis, but it's to say, here's 3 propositions, and these 3 propositions all cannot be true at the same time, but they're all very intuitive. So we need to solve this puzzle. We need to figure out what to say about this. And what's interesting is you don't actually have to solve the puzzle often to get published. If it's a new interesting puzzle, you can often publish just the fact that there's a puzzle here. So that's kind of a sort of different kind of positive paper, but one that I think is interesting and worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, actually,
I don't know if go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say one of my very first publications is a paper like that. It's a puzzle about the Trinity that I didn't really invent. Other people have sort of thought of it before, but no one had ever really written it up as far as I could tell. But the paper is really just like, okay, here's a puzzle, and it's not solving the puzzle. It's just pressing the problem, and that's it.
Yeah, this isn't like as rare as you would think. I mean, I think it's probably more rare than just a paper arguing for a positive thesis. But if you start looking at philosophy journals, you'll see papers like this, and it's kind of interesting. And it's fun too, because you read that and then you want to try to solve it. You're like, oh, like what do we say to this? So I think people get excited about those. I wanted to say one last thing about kind of the interaction between steps 4 and 5. But did either of you want to add anything about step 5 specifically before I say that?
No. I'm good.
Oh, so I was thinking there's maybe a third type of positive paper, and that's presenting a new theory, right? So you can give I guess that fits into positive thesis, but you had said like a new argument, but you could also give just a new theory. That kind of paper exists as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So within each of these, there's a variety of different, I think, ways you could go about it. And we might be missing some too, but I think this covers most of the lay of the land. So yeah. All right. So the last thing I wanted to say, so maybe I'll just remind us of these 5 steps. It was determine your aim, settle on a perfect. Settle on a topic or question, find a trustworthy overview of your topic, use that to map out a research plan, and then decide what kind of paper to write if applicable. And so notice that kind of steps 3 and 4 are sort of about reading and saying, like, what have other people written? Like, how are other people thinking about this? And then step 5 is deciding what paper to write. And we did that because I do think that is probably a slightly more natural way to do it. But I also think it's not totally unacceptable to kind of think about what you want to write first, and then maybe even start writing it, and then as you write, get a sense of the literature as you're going. And so maybe part of it too, you can do both of these at the same time, sort of steps 3 and 4 and 5 at the same time. And a couple reasons you might want to do some writing first before you kind of get a sense of the literature. The first thing is related to that thing where there's so much literature on certain topics. Like just Pascal's wager, there's like hundreds of papers, like dozens of books. And this is just like philosophical ones. Then there's like theology and history, and like, it just explodes. And so if you try to put pressure on yourself to literally read everything, I think that's honestly going to be impossible. Even for my dissertation, I didn't read everything. So again, like what I do is probably even more intense than what most people do, where I just make a bibliography with everything. But even doing that, I don't think you have to do that. So the first thing is, if you feel like you have to read everything, or you get really bogged down with this research plan, you might never make it to writing. But I think the other thing too is, when you read a literature super closely, it's easy to kind of absorb the assumptions that literature is making and think about the problems and the questions in the same way that everyone else is. And sometimes it can actually be really valuable and really nice to kind of think of a topic and then write out some of your own thoughts and questions and the way you're thinking about things first, and then kind of come back and see how that fits with the way other people have been thinking about it. Because you might realize, like, everyone in this literature is actually making this assumption that they don't really see, but it's actually not justified. And there's a bunch of reasons that you shouldn't assume that. Or everyone in this literature is like working in this particular framework, but like, what if we thought about it in this other framework, you know? So I think reading too much can actually inhibit creativity, and I can maybe force you. It almost might even force you to feel like you're doing something that's more like a response paper. Whereas if you write first, it might kind of help you come up with your own new theories or ideas, and then kind of fit that into the way other people have thought of it. And I guess too, you might say, well, then what if you write first, but then you end up just writing the same thing that someone else said? And I think that's a genuine worry, and that's why it is important to be familiar with some of the literature before you write, and maybe don't like write and polish your entire paper before you read anything at all in the literature. But I think the other thing to note is that, at least in philosophy, a lot of times people will say, like, that person stole my idea, or that person, they call it scooped me. But when you really think about it, the ideas are actually more distinct than you think. You might have like brought this connection between these two things, but then you see the connection very different than the other person does. So I think it's easy to say like they stole my idea, but really you're probably not thinking about it the exact same way. And I guess like on a practical note too, a lot of people will publish basically the same paper and not really realize it. So I don't know if you've noticed this, Justin, but there's this interesting connection between permissivism and self-fulfilling beliefs, and it's a pretty specific connection. And when I was going through the permissivism literature, I noticed, I want to say like 7 different papers, all written by different people that didn't cite each other, that were just about this connection. And I actually was like a little bit frustrated, because I was like, come on, guys, like, you need to follow Justin's and my 5-step plan. No, but like, they're clearly not like looking at all the literature before they're writing the thing that they're going to write. And it'd be one thing if it was 2 people, but the fact that it was 7, I was a little bit like, really? But the point is just that on a practical note, you could probably still get it published even if someone else published something very similar. So if you're just trying to publish to get a job or get tenure, and someone else has a similar project, that doesn't mean you should stop pursuing it necessarily. So.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Justin and Liz. This was really informative, and I hope that the viewers feel empowered now. Like, hey, I have a specific game plan for getting answers to these questions that I have. I'm not just going to waste a bunch of time searching the corners of the internet for random blogs. I know to that time is better spent on a trustworthy source, and you've listed those for us. So I'm really appreciative.
Awesome.
Okay, so what I want to do now is get some questions from the viewers. Okay, so let's go back. It's taking me just a moment. I want to get to where. Okay. I found the first question.
Cool.
Thanks for being patient, everyone. Looks like it comes from Anthony Rowden. He says, or asks, how helpful do you find it to write up what is that word? I can't hear you, Justin.
Oh, wait, am I frozen?
Now I hear you.
Okay, I'm told it's pronounced précis.
You'll have to explain that. Write a précis, either for significant books or articles you read.
So it just means a summary, basically. I have found that super helpful, actually. I've been doing quite a bit of that the last few years since I started getting close to working on my dissertation. And now I have a couple of Google Docs that are just really long documents of like little summaries, like almost like abstracts of papers and books that I've read. So for papers, sometimes it's just a paragraph summary. Sometimes if I think it's important and there's a lot of details I want to remember, it's a multi-paragraph summary. For books, I usually have like a paragraph or so per chapter that I summarize. And I found it enormously helpful to, like, you know, now that I've got this like sort of database of like, okay, here's, you know, the short version of all this stuff that I spent a summer reading, and then I can go back to. And also because I wrote it out in my own words to like summarize, you know, what they said, when I get to a point in a paper or my dissertation where I need to summarize somebody else's view, I've already done it. So it's just copy and paste. So I found that enormously helpful.
Okay,
Yeah,
Jackson.
that's
Did you
great.
want to say something, Liz?
Well, no, I was just gonna say, when I do it, I'll often do more like an outline type thing. But I agree with everything Justin said, and I've found it similarly helpful as well. But I think I wanted to add too, at least personally, I have so much trouble just sitting down and reading something like more passively, and it helps me like stay focused and retain the information better if I'm even just jotting notes as I'm reading. So I will, especially if something's important, I'll have it pulled up, reading it, but then also be writing even just a basic outline or basic notes to myself as I'm reading. And I find that helpful both for the reading process, but also for all the reasons Justin said too.
You can build on that probably here. Jackson Howard asked, how do you systematize your notes on articles when researching for a specific paper?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm probably not the most organized person as far as this goes. But basically, I just have, so like I have one Google Doc for like ethics related papers and books, and one for metaphysics. And now I've got one for Eastern philosophy because I'm teaching Eastern philosophy this coming spring semester. And that's been super interesting, by the way, but I won't go off on that tangent right now. And so I have maybe a very coarse-grained sort of system of like, okay, well, few broad topics, and then within each document, it's like kind of alphabetical by author, and, you know, just summaries of books and papers. That's as far as my systematization goes, though.
Yeah, I also probably could be more organized with this, but I have a folder that's called literatures, and then within that folder I have general topics like philosophy of religion and epistemology, and then within those folders I have more specific topics. I know this sounds really organized. It's not as organized as you would think, because there's so many gaps and a lot of it's incomplete. But like I said, for the topics that I am researching on frequently, I make those documents with the bibliographies in them. And that is probably the most helpful thing, because I have the reference written out in a way that I can copy paste it directly onto my bibliography. And I've tried with different citation softwares. That's like a whole nother thing, but they're so clunky. I just haven't found a good one, and I don't write in LaTeX. So I've tried them, but they haven't worked well for me. So I just use copy paste. But I have that. And then under it, I have 1 to 3 bullet points of just summarizing, here's some big things about the article. I like the idea of having a summary in your own words you can copy paste. Mine's much more informal than that. And sometimes I'm like, this is crap. It's like, probably don't want to copy paste that. But another thing I will do is, if I'm really if an article is super important or a book is super important, I'll have that outline that I write as I read, and I go back and refer to those a ton. And so I have that in a separate folder than I have my whole literature overview documents. But if I'm Sarah Moss's book, Probabilistic Knowledge, I read that a few years ago, I can go back and here's an overview of the chapters, here's the notes I took while reading. Sometimes it's helpful to put your own thoughts in a different color font, or in italics or something. So sometimes I'll write reactions to things in a way that's distinguishable from the rest of it. But yeah, I also find too, having a system of folders where you have a lot of the articles on permissivism, and then I usually name them author and then date, because that's how I would cite them in a paper. So Jackson 2019, that's what I would name the file. And I find that also helping with organization. So.
Jairo Izquierdo asks, any free resources on how to write and structure an article?
I feel like there probably are, but I also don't know what they are.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm Googling it right now. Cool. Michael Huemer, yes, I just found it. He has an article. So he was the one I mentioned earlier, who I think is a very clear writer, and I think a lot of people should emulate him. He has a thing, I just Googled Michael Huemer, how to write a philosophy article. I think it's actually called A Guide to Writing. And I haven't read this in a little while, but I think I remembered it actually being pretty good for the kind of thing we're talking about, where it's useful for students, but also it's useful for people that are writing professional philosophy. He kind of talks about things that would be relevant for both. So that's one thing I can recommend, at least off the top of my head. And he actually has a lot of very specific, even wording suggestions, don't use the word based off of, or the phrase, don't. Yeah, so stuff like that, or use begs the question in this way and not in this way, and things like that. So that's one thing that I can recommend off the top of my head. I want to say,
that sounds like a great resource. I told the viewers that in that link in the description at the last slide, it says for more info, go to this. I'll add that link to the document because it sounds really helpful.
Perfect. Yeah, that's at least one thing I can recommend off the top of my head. If I think of other things, I'll send them to you, Jordan, and you can put them there as well. I'm sure there are other things, but it's hard to be able to just rattle them off the top of your head,
Yeah,
I know there is a paper that's mostly about stylistic concerns, but it's for people writing academic papers. And it's one that one of my mentors really likes, but I don't remember what it's called. So maybe I'll try to find that afterwards as well and pass along a link.
And one thing I'll mention too is there's a number of books that are just about writing. And I go on and off with these. I'm not always reading a book about writing, but sometimes it's actually really, really useful to just read books about writing advice when you're writing a lot. And this won't apply to everyone listening to this, but I find it really helpful. I mean, I can send you some of these, Jordan, as well. I have a folder of a couple, and some of them are about how to structure things and how to use language clearly. And then some of them are actually about how to motivate yourself to write. And we haven't talked about that as much, but setting aside time regularly for writing and blocking off blocking off writing time as a meeting with yourself. So I think books on both of those are very helpful.
Planning as Bulldog asked, I want to really dig into all possible literature on the ontological argument in hopes of developing my own. How can I find as many papers and books as possible on a specific topic like this? Okay,
so here's what I recommend. There is a book that was published just a couple of years ago. It was edited by Graham Oppy, and it's an anthology of new essays on the ontological argument. So I would actually start there, read through that book, and then look at the bibliography. I mean, actually, I hope, I haven't looked to see, but hopefully there's a bibliography in the back of the book that's just got everything that all the papers in the book cite. But that's where I would go to start with like an in-depth study of ontological arguments, because it's recent and it will cite most of the relevant literature.
Yeah.
Do you feel like I've done that as well? One of the first things I try to look for is an anthology, by a trustworthy anthology.
Yeah.
When I'm getting this overview, I feel like that's helped me out several times.
Yes, it has for me as well. I remember I found there's an anthology on the evidential argument from evil, edited by Dan Howard Snyder. It's pretty old now. It's from like 1996. But when I was new to the academic literature on the problem of evil, I found that book extremely helpful, especially with respect to skeptical theism. A lot of the stuff in there is about skeptical theism, and it kind of starts from the beginning and, brings you up as far as, mid 90s. There's other anthologies on the problem of evil that are more recent now. But yes, I have had that experience as well, Jordan.
Okay.
Can I add? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't want to drag this on too long. Just two quick things. There is an SEP article on ontological arguments as well. I just looked it up. So that's another thing to look at, although I really like Justin's suggestion. The other thing is Tyrone Goldschmidt, who Jordan had on his channel maybe a couple months ago, also just wrote a book on ontological arguments. So you might check out those too. Okay, that was it.
Finding Truth asked, according to you, who has the best work currently about the Kalam, and where can I find free articles or free published work about it?
Yeah. Okay. So it seems to me that the interesting stuff that most philosophers who think about the Kalam are really excited about right now is the Grim Reaper stuff. But I don't specialize on the Kalam, so this is just my impression of like what people are most excited about. And for the Grim Reaper stuff, there's a paper by Rob Coons, what journal? I think it was in Noose from a few years ago that kind of introduced the subject to the literature, but it's a pretty technical paper. And then there's Alex Pruse's book, Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, which is a much more detailed discussion of paradoxes like the Grim Reaper paradox and some related things, and a defense of his view, causal finitism. Unfortunately, that's also a super technical course. So actually, probably the best place to go for stuff that's less technical, I think, Cameron on Capturing Christianity has had some people on to talk about this. He's had Rob Coons on a couple of times. I think there's also some more recent stuff that's that Coons has done that's directed at a more introductory audience. So there's an anthology of papers in philosophy of religion for students that was just redone, and there was a new edition of it published in 2020. I think it was just called, what was it called? Let me see if I can find this really quick. But the section on the cosmological argument, it's Coons and Oppie have essays responding to each other. And one of the things Coons talks about in there is the Grim Reaper paradox. And I think he tries to present it in a somewhat more accessible way. And also, both of those papers they'll cite, other work. Let me see if I can find this book.
While you're looking it up and you can come back, I'm going to ask this question. This is the last question I'll ask. And then Maverick Christian has a surprise for us. So, okay. What if someone doesn't have an academic degree and still wants to write articles with the rigor of an academic paper for a popular audience, maybe a blog or Facebook page or a YouTube channel?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that's great. And I think I would encourage you to, pursue philosophy and, really try to be rigorous. But I will say this, and this isn't to discourage you, it's just just so you know, writing rigorous academic papers takes a lot of training. It's not something you can just pick up overnight. It's not something that you can just kind of do because you've read a couple of philosophy articles. And so I think it's awesome that you want to do that. I think that's really great. And you can do that, but I don't want you to think it's going to be this super easy thing. So yeah, like I'm trying to think of concrete advice. I mean, I think a lot of the things we talked about today, just familiarizing yourself with like the SEP or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or the work that is actually being done by legit scholars on this, is something that some people on YouTube do, like Cameron and Jordan, and some people on YouTube do not do. So I would encourage you to the extent that you can, try to really figure out like what is going on with real scholars who are working on this. If they have, interviews or things that are written for more accessible audience, that's great. Try to look at those. But then I think it's also just going to take a ton of practice and training. And I mean, depending on your goals, you could even think about maybe enrolling in a grad degree program. I mean, that's not for everyone. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but the nice thing about even being in a master's program is just that you have mentors, you have people helping you, and you also have other students that you can work with and work alongside with and read each other's papers and give comments. And it is hard to do it without that kind of support and without that kind of community. So again, I'm not trying to discourage you, but I still have so much to learn about writing, and there's like, it's just funny, like just as an example, like someone asked a question about the Kalam argument. Justin and I are both philosophers of religion, and we couldn't even tell you off the top of our heads, like a bunch of details about the literature. I mean, we knew stuff, and I could tell you, Proust and Rasmussen, but like, I wouldn't be probably qualified to write a Stanford Encyclopedia article on that, even though I'm a philosopher of religion. And that just shows you how specific things really do get. And so I think, it's great to want to get philosophy out there, and it's great to want to write for a public audience, but it takes training and it takes time and it takes reading. You have to read a lot. And one thing I wanted to add too is I think if you can find other people that are also interested in philosophy and read through things together, that's really, really valuable too. One thing I was really fortunate as an undergrad, Andrew Moon was a professor actually at the school, Kansas State, which is the shirt I'm wearing. And he walked us through a philosophy of religion anthology, me and 4 or 5 other friends that were all philosophy majors interested in philosophy of religion. It was so valuable to read things with them and say, I don't understand this. Like, what's the difference between A theory and B theory of time? I've never heard of that. And, Andrew was obviously super helpful because he could explain a lot to us. But even if you don't have someone like that, having other people with similar interests that you can read things with is also super valuable.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And actually, I guess you said this, but maybe just to reiterate, in light of those factors, the best way to develop that skill of being able to write an academic paper for a popular audience is actually to probably get the official academic training. And you can do that without, you don't have to, if you say already went to college and you didn't study philosophy, it's possible still to get to do graduate work in philosophy. And I know it's possible because I did it. My undergrad degree was basically in kids' book illustration. Okay, so nothing to do with, well, almost nothing to do with philosophy. And now I'm writing a dissertation in metaphysics at UMass. So it can be done. And honestly, the academic context is probably the best way to do it because you have the guidance and you have the community that's supporting you, which is what Liz was saying.
Yeah, another thing too on that is a lot of people, I don't know if you did this, Justin, actually, I think maybe you didn't, but a lot of people will do like a terminal master's degree. And that enables them, like a lot of times terminal master's degrees are, that means you're getting a master's degree, but not also getting a PhD at the same institution. And a lot of them are much more open to accepting people that didn't study philosophy. And it's possible to just go straight to a PhD program. But I know, I mean, Talbot is one that a lot of people interested in philosophy of religion go to. There's also Palm Beach Atlantic is one that I'm actually going to be teaching at part-time. They're starting up a terminal master's degree in philosophy of religion. So that's another place to look if you didn't study philosophy, is these terminal master's programs. And then also too, it's kind of less of a commitment. You can kind of see if it's right for you. You do the 2-year thing. And then if you just love it and can't get enough with it, go on and do a PhD. And then know the job market's bad. That's a topic for another video. We could actually talk about like higher education, grad school, and philosophy sometime, but that's a whole other topic. So.
Yeah, and actually that is what I did. I did from undergrad. I went to a master's. Sorry, am I frozen?
No, I hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. From undergrad, I went to a master's at a theological school, and then did a master's in just regular philosophy at it was University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. They have a good terminal MA program. So that is the path that I took, and I think that point you just made, Liz, is a really good one. A terminal MA is a great way to kind of like try it out and figure out, okay, do I really want to go down this road of academic, research or whatever.
And with that, I will put up Maverick Christian's generous super chat. Thank you so much, Maverick Christian. He gave a super chat of $2, and he said, "Great advice, Liz, but not Justin."
Come on, Justin. What you doing?
You weren't able to satisfy the Maverick.
Well, I mean, Liz is further along in the profession than I am, so it makes sense.
All right.
Well, good, though. Don't worry.
Once again, thank you so much, Justin. Thank you so much, Liz. I think this was, at the very least, this was extremely helpful to me, and I think it was extremely useful to the viewers. If you thought that, I'd love to hear that in a comment. You can leave a comment on the video. And for those that are interested in more about Christian philosophy, you should subscribe to the channel, because that's what we do here. And I'm trying very hard to build a kind of free educational resource on Christian philosophy, and I'm constantly thinking of ways to do that. All right. With that, I will say goodbye. Have a good evening, and thanks for watching.